as we sat in the opening session, a thought occurred to me that much like in classrooms everywhere, even senior participants in a course like this prefer the back of the room, and nobody wants to sit in the front row. So some things don't change. Anyway, it's a great pleasure, great privilege to be here with you, and I want to thank the director of the IIM and all of you for inviting us. I want to thank also Alka, the leader of our team from the Institute of Chinese Studies, for bringing me here. I've been to Shillong before, but I think this visit is even more delightful, although it's only the second day, start of the second day that we are here. And I look forward to a very interesting program. Now, I'm a little bit daunted in terms of what I had to say, what I wrote out in a bit of a hurry, because I didn't know who were the participants. I had no idea that your institute has been running a program for 4 years now of regular exchanges with China. So I'm not speaking to a bunch of novices, I'm speaking to people who have their own knowledge of China, faculty who have first-hand knowledge. And I also didn't know that I would have here a colleague, if I can use that term, because he's married to a foreign service officer, so in a sense he's a member of the family. Somebody who has intimate, in-depth knowledge of what happens in China. So compared with everything that is already available, the few things I have to say are not very profound, probably very banal, so my apologies in advance for this. I'll go straight into the few points I had, and I do really want to take up on the offer that was made right at the beginning by Rohit and also by the director of the Institute, Professor Dev, that this should be a conversation. This should be an informal exchange. So I would greatly appreciate if you stop me wherever you wish to make a point, to make a comment, because this is not a lecture. I have no lecture to deliver, I have no PowerPoint. I have simply a few thoughts I want to put before you, maybe to provoke you into reacting to these and coming up with your own conclusions, because I don't think I have any answers. If anything, I have questions. I first went to China in August 1963. In those days, China was recovering from the ravages, from the massive upheaval of the Great Leap Forward and of all the excesses which were carried out during that period. But it was on a path to recovery. So there was a little bit of increasing prosperity in China in very, very comparative terms. I wish I'm a photographer and I have a huge collection of slides which I have neglected. Many of them are maybe no longer in the pristine condition in which they were initially. But if you can see an image of China in those days, the country was tightly restricted as far as foreigners went. We were 35 embassies perhaps in Beijing. Every diplomatic car had a plate this big, made in enamel, red on white, very, very visible, which had just one Chinese character on it, Shi, which means diplomat. So a diplomatic car could be identified at long distance because it was a huge plate, front and back. We were confined to a radius of 20 kilometers from the center of Peking, with 3 exceptions: the Great Wall, the Ming tombs which are on the way to the Great Wall, and the airport, the old airport, which is in the same place, but the same location really, but of course the new airport is so far apart and so different from the old airport that you can't even begin to imagine what the old airport was like. But at the old airport, for example, the AFP correspondent was a delightful man called Jacques Marcuse. Jacques had his bottle of Mau Tai at the airport. Today, what is the price of Mau Tai? $1,200. $1,200. In my days, RMB, which is equal to $200 US. In my days, the price of a bottle of Mau Tai was 15 yuan. And Jacques' bottle of Mau Tai was available at the bar to any friend who was stuck at the airport, waiting for a delayed flight or waiting to catch a flight that was delayed in takeoff, and that happened very frequently. You simply went to the bar and said, in Chinese of course, I don't speak English, bring me Mr. Marcuse's bottle of Mau Tai, and it would appear. And it was bottomless, and it never got empty. Somehow it was refilled by Jacques whenever it happened. But that was the informality in which we lived. If you saw another diplomatic car, you not only knew who it belonged to, but you could make a guess as to where the guy was going, including which girlfriend of his he was going to visit. All foreigners, of course. You could not meet any Chinese. You could not have conversation with any Chinese because that person would get into difficulty. It was not that you would be in trouble, but that individual would be in trouble because the system of street committees, work committees was so lethal. Those committees still exist, mind you, and except that they operate differently now. Everybody wore blue clothes. Blue was absolutely the standard attire, but some colors were beginning to appear. Women sported scarves, and then they started wearing bright colored shirts and tops, etc. in the summer. So China was slightly relaxing its heavy clutches of that terrible period. A period during which 10, 15 million people died. I want to put China in context a little bit. I'm digressing a little from my theme. Just to tell you that any time you think of making a comparison of India and China, there are so many points of difference that today we so easily forget. A country that has seen in the recent past, I'm not talking of the historical past, I'm not talking of the pre-independence or pre-liberation as the Chinese call it period, but I'm talking of post-independence liberation, where such trauma was visited upon a people. So the Chinese of today are the sons and the grandchildren of the people who have gone through those nights of nightmare. I don't think any Indian can relate to this, because we've never seen this in India. The last major tragedy in India of national proportion was the Great Bengal Famine of 42-43. Every Bengali remembers this vividly, because every Bengali has a family history in which this is remembered. Am I right, Professor? But even that Bengal famine was a Bengal famine. I don't think we guys living in Gujarat or people living in South India really felt the ravages. Here was a cataclysmic event that traumatized an entire nation. All you saw in Beijing was bicycles. There were very, very, very few cars. The bicycles were like swarms of locusts, you could say. It's not a nice comparison, but they were so numerous. If you were a driver, you were constantly terrified a little bit that you might hit a cyclist, because they were just so numerous on the roads. You had to learn intuitively, looking from the rear, at the profile of the cyclists in front of you, were they going to suddenly make a turn across your path of travel? And if you notice the cycle lean a little in one direction, you could figure out that he's now going to make a turn in the other direction. That's how people make turns on a bicycle. You learn these things intuitively. I went back to China in 1970, when China was waking up from another trauma, which again the Chinese had inflicted on themselves, or shall we say the great helmsman, Mao, had inflicted on China. Again, in which untold millions died. Nobody knows how many died during the Cultural Revolution, but it cannot be less than several million, if not maybe 10 million. Now the China of today, there are people who remember those nightmares. The young of China, of course, don't know anything about it. But they've heard stories in family accounts. Their grandmothers have told them what it was like to live through those times. So, if China today appears, for Indians at least, a fairly disciplined society, a fairly work-oriented, fairly organized bunch of people, it is because they have lived through these nightmares as recently as the late 50s and 60s and very early 70s. We have not known anything like this at any point in our independence movement. And that's of course the other comparison. I will not go into that, but you should, if you're interested, make for yourselves a comparison between the independence movements of China and India and what each country went through. In the case of China, of course, it was the great neighbor Japan, which was the inflictor of such incredible agony upon the country. If you look at China-Japan relations today, you cannot understand it if you do not go back to 1895 and everything that the Japanese have done to the Chinese ever since. I'm not anti-Japanese, but you can't be a student of China and not feel for what China has suffered at the hands of Japan. Okay, let me get to my little talk. I want to begin by talking about cultural management, cultural behavior. I don't know if this is part of your curriculum, it probably is, but it is the writings of 2 or 3 scholars that are important points of reference for me. One is Geert Hofstede, who is a Dutch scholar, and another is Edward Hall. And then there is also Richard Lewis, who also has some very interesting things to say. To Hofstede we owe an insight into what he calls cultural markers. Hofstede's book, by the way, is called The Software of the Mind. That is the subtitle of the book. I forget the exact title. I think it is Cultural Management or Understanding Culture.
Culture's Consequences.
Sorry?
Culture's Consequences.
Culture's Consequences. But it's the software of the mind, which is really the catchy part of the title of his book. And the 6 markers he offers are really very, very interesting. They are relevant first to understanding ourselves. I mean, you cannot engage in intercultural study if you do not begin with yourself. And not simply to say I look in the mirror and look at myself, but use some of these analytical tools to see where do we figure in terms of a comparative analysis of cultures. The first of these is power distance, where we score very high, as do the Chinese, as do most Asians. That is the level of inequality, social inequality in a society. Not economic, not material, but social inequality. And we are a land of enormous inequalities, of course. Hofstede, whom I have met, said at a conference something very insightful. he said, I have no causal, analytical reason for this. But he said countries of high power distance are also countries where corruption is very high. We should pause to think a little of this. Is it that social inequality breeds corruption? Because Japan is again a country of great social inequality. I mean, you look at the Japanese have scales on which or against which the depth of your bow is measured.
Even the language has 5 levels.
Languages has.
We have 3.
Language has 5 forms, exactly right. And that is why learning Japanese is so enormously difficult. Because the way a father talks to a daughter, the daughter talks to her classmate, and the classmate talks to a family retainer. Of course, they don't exist anymore, but when they did, all these are different forms. So, that's one very interesting marker. Handling uncertainty. This is again a very interesting marker because societies that can handle uncertainty are societies that manage quite well in the chaotic world. I mean, we in India, we are masters of chaos management. Because India is a land of chaos. Every morning, morning's traffic is an example, it's a demonstration of chaos. You bring a German into the heart of Shillong, in the middle of a traffic jam, he would give up. He would say, how can you drive in a place of this madhouse? Or in Delhi, even better. I mean, I constantly heard from Japanese friends, German friends, European friends, but particularly Germans, how impossible it was to manage in Delhi. Individualist or collective. And this is again interesting. Japan is the epitome of a collectivist society. I had an intern once, a Japanese intern who helped me in Washington DC when I was a scholar at the Wilson Center. And she had grown up in the Philippines, daughter of a completely 100% Japanese family. And when she went back, and we remain in touch, and she's told me how difficult it has been for her to reintegrate into life in Japan. Because they said, but you are a foreigner. She said, but I'm Japanese. I mean, I speak Japanese. I've had a Japanese language education right up to high school. They said, yes, but you lived abroad. So how can you understand us? How can you understand the way in which we treat each other? That is the extent of collectivism, the sense of belonging to the in-group, etc. China, in contrast, I don't know if you will agree with me. For me, China is very much an individualist society. It has a veneer of collectivism imposed by Mao and thinking of those days, but it is really like India. I mean, we are the epitome of an individualist society. Masculine and feminine, this is not a terribly interesting yardstick, but like India, like Japan, like many others, but say unlike Thailand, China is a masculine society, I would say. Gratification cycle, this is an interesting yardstick. Are people willing to let go of today's pleasures for a better tomorrow? And that way China, like India, is very much a society that attaches a high value to tomorrow. Parents will make sacrifices for children. In the United States, parents will, son is 18, parents will give him a kick in the butt and say, now go and make your own life. You want to go to college, earn your way. Bill Gates can tell his children, I'll give you a few $1 million, but the rest of the money is not for you. Can you imagine any Indian parent ever saying to their children that, I'll give 90% of my money, 99% like Zuckerberg, into charity? And of course, indulgence or restraint. There again, that's a very interesting criterion. And I think both India and China rank high on indulgence, but I would say China ranks perhaps even higher than India in terms of indulgence. Hall markers, Edward Hall's markers are quite subtle. He talks of the level of non-verbal communication. This is a very interesting marker. It is something that has to be studied carefully. Both China and India are countries of high levels of non-verbal communication. You take a country like Denmark, the Danes don't understand what is non-verbal communication. This is communication means you talk. If you don't talk, there is no communication. But they don't realize that in Japan, for example, two good friends can meet and sit together and be in silence for half an hour. And they don't feel that there is any lack of communication. They are communicating, but in other ways. That's how we operate. High or low context. This again is a very, very important cultural behavior marker. There are countries which are countries of high context, countries of low context. High context country really means that whatever you say, or whatever you do, or whatever moral imperative you lay down, has to be seen in a context. So, one common phrase that comes up in a high context country is always, it depends. That you have to, you can't simply say, speak the truth as an imperative. I mean, even the Bhagavad Gita tells you, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata tell you, yes, truth is important, but there are exceptions. There are occasions on which truth needs to be shaded. Then there are other criteria like chronemics, which is time behavior, and proxemics, which deals with how close people stand or interact with one another, which are interesting, but it's not all that relevant really. In one of my books, I have some comments about China's negotiation style, but that book was written really in the context of interstate behavior and diplomacy. It had nothing really to do with business at all. So whatever I offer over there, the ideas are not terribly relevant to the kind of things that are of interest to you. But for what it's worth, I would say, in terms of Chinese negotiators, Chinese very much will appeal to the ego of the person on the other side.
Sir, can you please give us the name of your book?
The book is called Asian Diplomacy. It was published in 2007, and it's very much in the market. OUP have an edition actually, an Indian edition. The book was published elsewhere, and it was then published also in an American edition. But the Indian edition is a lot cheaper. I wouldn't waste money on the American edition. But that book is really a study. It's a comparison of foreign ministries and diplomatic services of 5 countries: China, Japan, Singapore, Thailand, and India. Another trait in negotiation suggesting that the Chinese dignitaries steering the negotiation may be under threat until issues are resolved. This doesn't apply to business at all, really. A third is to take a strategic view of negotiations. That does apply. I think the Chinese tend to take a large view of a negotiation process. And I'm sure there will be occasion when this will come up, and you will be talking about it at some point, I'm pretty sure. And another Chinese method is to lay emphasis on the principles in negotiations. That is to frame the negotiation process in a larger sense. Of course, the intent is always to get what you want, but this is a more cerebral form of presenting your point of view, and I think the Chinese tend to do that. I also hold, at least this applies in diplomacy, the Chinese view an agreement as a benchmark and not a sacrosanct document. They don't take an agreement literally. I think you would agree that that is the case even in business. Now, the Germans, for example, to them an agreement is a sacred document. I mean, how can you deviate from an agreement? But to Indians also, I mean, agreement is a piece of paper. It's simply what we agreed on such and such day last year. But today things have changed, so we can renegotiate anything. That is very much also an Indian attitude. The Chinese do work consciously to put the other side off balance. This is a recurring theme in all the people who write about the Chinese negotiation style and behavior. And it really is a pretty central point. I mean, you have to take a great deal of care to make sure that you are not pushed off balance. So in business, and some of these views come from books, but some come from comments from my daughter-in-law, who has a fair amount of experience in dealing with Chinese companies, and you will, I'm sure, supplement this enormously with your rich contemporary experience in dealing with the Chinese. So, Chinese expect foreign partners to know their context. You can't simply say, oh, but I didn't know. You have to be able to analyze your own strengths and the strengths of the other side. You cannot simply assume that you know China. And that brings me to a key point, which is that of, first, language interpretation, and second, cultural interpretation. Well, let's first take language interpretation. I have a story which is not about China, unfortunately. I'm sure you will come up with Chinese stories which are much more pertinent to our subject. But let me tell you an Algerian story about language. You see, language is simply a vehicle through which ideas are conveyed. So language carries with it a huge cultural context. Simply translating a word from one language to another, simply translating a word or a phrase does not serve the purpose. And my story is about an American company which negotiated a contract in Algeria. And Algerian documents, French is used to be their working languages. I think it's still today, even today, the principal working language, although Arabic has grown a lot in the days since I served in Algeria some 30 years ago. There was a phrase in the contract, all taxes will be paid by the client, okay, which means the Algerian side. So the interpreter was an American, conversant with French language, knew the language well, simply translated this to say, tous les taxes doivent être payées par le client. Tous les taxes was the key phrase. All taxes became tous les taxes. Now what this translator did not know, this interpreter did not know, was that in France, in French usage, tax only refers to direct taxes. Indirect taxes in France are called impôts indirects. So if you use the word tax, it only means direct taxes. So they have two words for tax. Whereas in India, tax is tax. Tax includes indirect taxes, but not in French, not in French usage. The American client ended up paying $200,000 extra because the Algerian client said, we are only required to reimburse you direct taxes. The contract does not say impôt indirect. But he said, but you know, the English text says this. They said, that's your English text. We have nothing to do with it. Now, this tells you how important it is to know the context of the culture which goes beyond the language. I don't know if you have an example that can match that in terms of its salience. Other is, of course, the cultural context and cultural translation. If you have a major negotiation, I'm not talking of a contract for X amount of goods to be supplied or bought, but really a major negotiation in which you are deciding on future cooperation or working out a joint venture framework or whatever. It pays to have with you this beyond and the addition to the language interpreter, somebody who can interpret cultural signals to you in terms of how the other side is behaving, how they are acting, how they are functioning. And on this, many examples can be given. I will not get into hard examples. Guanxi is a word that comes up all the time when you talk with China, talk about China. Guanxi literally means relationship. But the way Guanxi is used in business practice, what it really means is the connections one has, the networking capabilities that are available to an individual. And China is all about networking in the same way that India is all about networking. So for Indians, Guanxi, networking are not alien notions because we network all the time. I mean, a traffic policeman stops you on the street for some minor violation. Your first question is, which police station do you belong to? Do you know Superintendent so-and-so? And we are using connections all the time. Business contacts, you meet somebody, you say, oh, he's from my college or he's from my institute, or we have worked together at such and such place, do you know him, etc. These are good devices when they are used properly, and they are used essentially to create a framework within which strangers can repose confidence in one another. And that is what Guanxi is all about really. It's about that, and it's also about using your connections to your advantage, to gain a little edge in a negotiation or in a contract or in a relationship where the other side takes you more seriously. I mean, when my friend tells me that his wife belongs to the foreign service, we are essentially using Guanxi. We are using a connection which then puts me in a position of looking at him in a different way than I would if I simply met him as a very smart lawyer and a business negotiator. So Guanxi is good, but we should be willing to use it, and we should be also tolerant of the other side using it. This is a classic example, sir, of not following on Western prescriptions. Because Westerners have their own frameworks. In Germany, for example, and I'm not exaggerating, in Germany, using a connection is considered extremely bad manners. Because they say, deal with me for what I am. Don't bring up connections and say, you know X and you know Y. It's nothing to do with me. I'm here doing a business. In fact, a German, if you offer a favor to a German, chances are he will not take it. He doesn't want to accept a favor because he said, why should you do me a favor? There are rules, you follow the rules. And I'm very happy with that. I don't want to take a favor from you because that may create an expectation that I will return the favor. And in our system, we don't do favors to anyone. In our system, doing favors is what we do all the time. It just comes naturally to us. And the Chinese are exactly like us. But in spades. They do even more of Guanxi than we do. They've elevated it to a fine art. Now, Western countries hate that. Western countries hate the idea of high context cultures, where what you say depends on when you say it. I mean, in Germany, when I worked in Germany, I'm not exaggerating. If I needed to talk to somebody on the phone, a top business executive, my secretary and his secretary would make an appointment for a phone call conversation. And my secretary would tell me that he will be free on Friday afternoon between 3 and 4 when we can call him and have a substantive discussion. When I sought an appointment with the CEO of a company, it usually took 6 to 8 weeks to get an appointment. In India, if you ask somebody 6 weeks in advance for an appointment, he will say, "Are you crazy?" He says, "I have no idea what I'll be doing in 6 weeks' time." Which means he's open to bids. If he has a better bid that comes up than your appointment, he says, "To hell with your appointment. I've been invited by the finance minister for a meeting, so I'm not going to honor that appointment." Indians don't make appointments 6 weeks in advance. Am I right? It's typical. We don't like to work in a long-term committed framework. These are just different ways of working.
Kind of changing in the IT world and business world.
Okay, of course the world changes. The world is changing because we learn from others, we realize that other countries operate in different ways. I mean, when you go to a German executive for an appointment, first, if you turn up 5 minutes late, you're meeting that guy in his office. And you say, "What the hell does it matter? I'm 5 minutes late, he's sitting in his office. If I don't turn up, he'll do his own work and I'll catch up in 5 minutes' time." He looks at it differently. He says, if this guy cannot even maintain a time schedule, how the hell is he going to maintain anything else? So, commitment is vital. In the United States, and I've heard this from American businessmen, this is not my story. He says, when I get a letter from a chap, a cold call letter, if the letter is not on quality stationery, and if the letter and the envelope are not of matching stationery, he says, I simply put it in the waste paper basket. Because I said, this guy doesn't know how to handle communication. Now, which of us has ever thought of matching the envelope to the letter stationery? And he said, this is a fad. I use whatever envelope that comes to hand. How many people will use that heavyweight, fine-grained paper for our corporate communication? Big companies do it. Many medium-sized companies says, we save money, use cheap paper. But you don't realize that is the impression you make. It all depends on the country where you operate. Part of the reason, and this is now the cultural factor, in India, nobody opens their own mail. You don't open your own mail, sir. You have a secretary who opens your mail. In the United States, even a CEO, chances are, will open his or her own mail. This is treated as personal. The act of opening your own incoming communication. Okay, all that is over now thanks to the internet and thanks to smartphones. But in the days when people communicated by letter, the format of the letter was important. Courtesies are important. Offering concessions, that you offer concessions only at the right moment. You don't offer them too much in advance. You can expect the Chinese to negotiate with you right down to the very, very last minute. And with the Chinese, everything is negotiable until everything is tied up. That's very much like the WTO. Nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. You cannot simply say, we have an interim agreement on this. He'll come back to that and say, we talked about it yesterday, but can we reopen that issue? Because that's just the way in which they function. We are enormously susceptible to gestures, and our egos are enormous. This applies to Indian officials, Indian politicians, and I dare say to Indian businessmen. This means that if somebody makes a gesture to us, we feel thrilled. We say, my gosh, this guy actually came to the airport to receive me. I mean, what has it costed me? A little bit of time or something? But don't read into that a political gesture. But the Indian press is full of, the American president dropped into a meeting where the Indian foreign minister was having a meeting with the national security advisor at the White House. And the Americans, it costs nothing. I mean, the president just leaves his office room, walks 20 meters down the corridor and drops into the national security advisor's office and says, hello, how are you? Spends 5 minutes with you. But we are thrilled. We say, what an important political gesture. There's nothing political about it. This is simply a calculated move that is intended to appeal to the ego of a people who have a huge ego. So, our ego is one of our big, big barriers. This applies to officials and to Indian leaders, but I dare say it also applies to corporate leaders. And the Chinese know this. I mean, the other side, not just the Chinese, the others know it. Incidentally, I don't know if you know the book, if you're interested in this subject, Raymond Cohen's book, Negotiating Across Cultures. That's a book that is absolutely a masterpiece. It's one of the few authentic, important studies on intercultural negotiation behavior. It's a subject that's not really been addressed terribly well by many people. And this came to me from my daughter-in-law, who says that expect the Chinese to have thought through a negotiation move several moves ahead. It is not simply one gesture or one phase of negotiation that the person, the other side will focus on. They will have considered all the different possibilities and counters that you may come up with. Another broad piece of advice, that losing your temper, either genuinely or play acting a loss of temper, in China is not worthwhile, because it usually will come back to bite you. It's not a device that is terribly, terribly effective. Face is important. I mean, people keep talking about it, but it's not just talk. One must not put the other side in a situation where that side feels humiliated or feels embarrassed about something. It would be graceful to avoid behavior that might embarrass the other side. We don't always think that through. Well, we say negotiation is the negotiation. If I can get advantage by embarrassing the other chap, what do I care about it? You have to care about it because you have to deal with those people, not just today, but over a longer period of time. The Chinese notion of chirku, to swallow bitterness, to hold out, to be relentless in pursuit of what you want. That is a typical Chinese hallmark, but they also admire it in others who can behave in the same fashion. So, being relentless in pursuit of what you want in a nice, pleasant way. I mean, some of the devices used, which people talk about, are it's smart to be a little dumb. That is to say, if you aren't in agreement with something, it's not just enough to say, I don't think that will work. One can keep asking, why do you think it is important? I mean, is it really, what are the reasons behind your position? Can you please explain that to me so that I can understand where you are coming from? Those kind of attitudes which essentially say no, but they say no in a different way, in a more pleasant way, in a more accommodative way. those things are worth doing. Because as somebody says, Chinese admire and respond to such relentlessness. I have a text, I think it's to be distributed to everyone, or it will be distributed? Will be distributed, okay. So I won't go into Ambassador Tommy Koh's suggestion. Ambassador Tommy Koh is a very, very wise old Singaporean bird. And he has 8 pieces of advice that he gives to diplomatic negotiators, but which also apply to others. And in my text, I give the reference where this text that I borrowed, where it comes from. And probably the most important of his 8 points is build a common basis of fact to narrow the gap. When facts are in dispute, a third party can help. This is very much part of the wisdom also of the Harvard negotiation process, which I hope you know about. One simply Googles Harvard project on negotiation and you come to a rich collection of case studies on negotiations that deal with all kinds of negotiations, from buying a second-hand car to settling interstate disputes. It's probably the richest single collection accumulated over something like 40 years by, who's the author of that book, Getting to Yes? A short little name. Getting to Yes is a famous, famous book of 150 pages. And if anybody who handles negotiation has not read that book, then I think you missed on one of the absolute classics on negotiation, one of the timeless classics of negotiation. What is the author's name? It's 2 authors, and one of them is a very short name. Yeah, they are two. Getting to Yes. No, they're both Americans. But somebody can look it up on a smartphone. Getting to Yes is an evocative book. And another thing that he, 2 other points that Tommy Koh makes, and I'll end with this really, are exercise emotional intelligence to win the trust of the opposite side. Winning trust is crucial. You may say, I'm in business. What the hell have I got to do with trust? But damn it, trust is the foundation on which every form of human interaction operates. When your son or daughter wants to go out with a bunch of friends, I mean, underlying everything is trust. How you handle that little family negotiation. And it applies to negotiations between adversary countries. Right now, India and Pakistan have kind of resumed a dialogue, okay? As a result of the meeting that took place in Bangkok, and now Foreign Minister Sushma Swaraj's visit to Islamabad. Now you may say, and I have many colleagues in the foreign service who say, the Pakistanis are blank, blank, blanks. You can't establish trust with these SOBs. But if you don't establish trust with an adversary, even within the limited framework of a negotiation process, it doesn't mean that you trust him with your life or that you trust him with your family jewels. It only means that you establish trust that in a process of negotiations, both sides are searching for a solution. And that is where trust becomes crucial. And the last point that Tommy Koh makes, Ambassador Tommy Koh, is talking about cultural intelligence. He says, realize that we all live within our cultural box. All too often, and this happens to everyone, negotiators assume that the other side thinks like us. I mean, they don't consciously say, oh, those guys are just like us. No. But the implicit assumption in the negotiation process is that because I think along those lines, A to B to C to D, they also think in a similar linear fashion. Their process of thinking may be convoluted. They may go jump from A to Q and Q come back to B. Until you talk, until you try and understand the cultural context of the other side, you cannot get to your own objective, which is coming out with the final outcome that you see. The very last point I want to make is that, sorry,
Is William Ewing.
sorry,
That book, Getting Past No and Getting Yes, the two books.
Yes.
Is William Ewing.
Yuri, that's the one, that's the short name of the URY. Yuri and there's somebody else. Yes, somebody.
Roger Fisher and Bruce.
Roger Fisher and Yuri, that's right. Really, I would strongly recommend that in any institute of management there should be at least 6 copies of that book, so that at least 3 can be stolen by smart students who don't want to buy their own copies, and the others will remain in the library, God willing. The director is not amused by my I mean, he says it happens all too often. Don't tell these guys what to do. Okay. The last point I want to make is, and this applies to a major negotiation, not a small negotiation. Italians did a lot of theorizing on diplomacy. They really thought through the process of how countries react with each other. Because exactly like in the days of Chanakya, in the 14th and 15th century, 16th century, Italy was a collection of small states and principalities which were at warfare, tension, dispute, and occasional cooperation with each other. So they learned the fine art of how to deal with one another, how to deal with countries. And there is an Italian scholar whose name I cannot pronounce really, but is Guancardi or whatever, who came up with the concept, the notion, that in a major negotiation, there is a point when the negotiation has proceeded along and there comes a ripe moment. This phrase, ripe moment, is identified with this man. And he said the ripe moment is the point where the two sides mutually, implicitly understand that the negotiation is in an end phase. Now, this is not Hollywood. Bells don't ring and angels don't sing to tell you that this is the end phase. A good negotiator understands intuitively that we are now really in the last lap. The marathon is coming to an end. We have entered the stadium. The final tape is visible to us. And we now have to work out how we both jointly find the final deal in that complex process. That is the stage where the final concessions are made. Now, the importance of final concessions is that if they are made too early, then the other side says, thank you very much. I put it in my pocket and then I say, what else will you do for me? So you can make a final concession only when there is a mutual, implicit agreement. It's not going to be a formal agreement, but implicitly both sides understand this is the time to put your last cards on the table and say, this is all that I will do for you. And the other side says, okay, if that's your final deal, this is my final offer to you. And then see if you can mesh the two together. One of the most illuminating negotiation processes that the world has seen in recent times was the Anglo-Irish Agreement of 1998, the so-called Good Friday Agreement. That agreement is enormously innovative because the hard issue was the future of Northern Ireland. Ireland said, it's our territory, it's Ireland. Britain said, yes, it is located in Ireland, but it's always had a British connection. So we cannot walk away from Northern Ireland. And the formula they found in that agreement was, they left the future of Northern Ireland to the future. They said simply, whenever an eventual agreement is reached on Northern Ireland, it must conform to these two principles. And there they put out the position of the two sides, which are contradictory. But they said, in the future, maybe some wisdom will dawn and maybe some kind of a final solution will be found. You know, with Musharraf, you may not trust a man, you may call him many names, but Musharraf also, India and Pakistan, almost came within grasp of a final deal on Kashmir. It was sabotaged. It was sabotaged really on the Pakistan side by the generals, by the army that did not really want an agreement at that point. But our negotiators, our principal negotiator, colleague of mine, Satyendra Lamba, has openly finally confirmed what Musharraf has said openly for the last 2 years, that we were within inches of a settlement on Kashmir. Again, on the basis that some part of that deal would have left the future of some parts of Kashmir or some aspects of Kashmir to be decided in the future. It's an ingenious solution between countries. It doesn't apply to business negotiation. So I'm in a sense boring you with needless and irrelevant detail. I think I'll stop here. I've gone on long enough. I would be delighted to engage in a conversation with you if I can offer any insights. I'm at your disposal. Thank you very much. Comments, observations, criticism. Please, go ahead.
So since you touched upon the German context, I was working with a German client and I used to send them pleasantries for pleasantries. I used to send them gifts for Indian festivals. And when I used to send them, they used to tell me, Sripal, what have you done? I mean, we have never accepted something like this. And I used to tell them, what have I done? I have just sent you a gift. I think that's the context culture which India has.
Little bit. I mean, Germans don't, gift. The practice of exchanging gifts is a very interesting subject. It's a subject on which you can really have a full lecture. You're right. Germans, Northern Europeans typically, are not very much into either giving or accepting gifts. But they understand the method of giving gifts. But there again, practices vary enormously. When I used to go to see these chief executives of companies, quite often they would offer a gift. Nothing very valuable. There's always, there is a kind of tameez about gift giving. It's only the Arabs who will give you gifts that are worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, at least to presidents and prime ministers. Well, it's really ridiculous. But more than once, the German executive I met would tell me that your secretary is a very nice lady. I said, yes, she's an Indian married to a German, speaks fluent German. They said, no, her German is very good, but that's all right. But she comes across as a very nice person. You see, telephone manners, telephone, the personality you are able to project on the phone is important. Many times I have received a gift to be given to my secretary. And in Germany, by the way, if you go to visit a senior personality and you do carry a gift for him, if you carry a gift for his secretary, if he is senior enough to have a secretary, because in Germany not everybody has private secretaries or assistants. But if you know that that individual has a secretary and you carry a small gift, I promise you, it will have more than the gift you give to the other guy. Because they will say, look at this person who is so thoughtful and understands that in our system, a secretary is a pretty important person. Not because he or she will do something for you extra, but simply that you are acknowledging the role that person is playing. So, gift giving is very important, and we as Indians, perhaps, I don't know if you agree with me, we perhaps tend to go overboard with gifts. It's good to be but then if you are in Asia, you do need to be overboard, because in Asia, it is also a culture of giving gifts. In China, for example, you must carry gifts. You have to carry gifts. If you don't have a gift, you will feel silly. वो दे रहा मेरे हाथ खाली. So China always carry a reserve stock of gifts with you in your briefcase.
Sir, I have one more question.
Sure.
You talked about China, and coming back to that context, Chinese believe that nothing is final until everything is final. When they believe that, are they susceptible to the fact that Indians also behave that same way?
Would you help me with this, please?
I was actually planning to when I did my MBA, this was the textbook, Hofstadter's Social Markers. So it's a very standard textbook. So the classroom was 110 students, 102 of them were Chinese, 8 of us were foreigners. So there were all kinds of people. I was in India. So the professor asked each one of the foreigners to stand up and admit or agree or disagree with all these markers about our own cultures. So the impression was, when each of the factors, when I said yes, Indians are like this, the Chinese students, 102 of them were surprised. Are Indians so similar? Because they have some notions of how we were colonized by English and we have all lock, stock and barrel become Englishmen.
Exactly.
So when Ambassador was talking about these factors, so the interesting thing what I find when Indian companies and Chinese companies negotiate is precisely this. So fine, once you're established, you're just like us and we are just like you. What next? Because for Americans and Chinese to negotiate, there's a playbook. There's exactly, experiences, case studies. But for India and China, well, at least for investment, because this is a distinction I always make. Trading is a very different type of relationship. When an Indian company goes and buys something from China, which has been happening for several decades. But investment negotiations are very different. They're far more complex, they're far more nuanced, and they need to be kind of comprehensive. As you said, you can't leave something open. So it's much different. So these are the challenges we are facing in the last 4 or 5 years. And the number of people who have insights or experience in this, both in India and China, are very few. Essentially, they are the companies who have invested in India, or some Indian companies have invested in China. But that is a slightly different context, because all foreign companies tend to behave in a certain manner in China. So Indians have just joined that category and they behave like any American company or anything.
That's a mistake.
That's a mistake. I mean, but that's the way, Indian companies are not seen that much as Indian companies. They do various things to look, like for example, Tata. Their Jaguar Land Rover plant is a phenomenal success. But they have done a lot of that by posing as a British brand, which they are, but they don't really put the Indianness in the front, because it may not help, it's not practical. But for Chinese, there's no go. They can't come here and pretend to be Korean or Japanese or anything. They have to be Chinese. And the Indian company on its home turf has to deal with that. So this is a very interesting question. And what normally happens is, the crude way of saying it is like a tutu meme. It's like never ending. So Indians never consider the agreement as final. The Chinese also don't consider it as final. So sometimes it's frustrating. But for a professional, it's very good learning. And this is where I think there's a lot of learning to be done, even now. Because this is just the beginning. And in the next 20, 30 years, this might reach a stage where people will say, this is the standard way where Indians negotiate with Chinese and Chinese negotiate with India in the business sphere. But so far, that book has not been written. I mean, there's no Bible to go by. So it's very exciting.
We need more peace.
That's all I can say.
Also it depends whether you are selling into China or buying from China. If you are buying from China, I think the negotiations are far simpler.
Yes.
Because there is a trade, it's important for them to sell outside, they want to get some money out of the whole thing, make the deal. But if you are selling into China, I think the contracts becomes more and more complex, and nothing is final till it is closed.
You know, there was one point that I didn't touch on, and I think it's worth mentioning, is how the Chinese side perceives India. We have gone a little bit overboard into making claims for our own country. We are moving forward, that everything is going smoothly, etc. Firstly, about 15 years back, the Chinese hated any China-India comparison. They felt that this was ridiculous. I mean, India is a country that is dirty, chaotic, unmanageable, virtually, ungoverned. How can you compare it with China? And you know, the taxi driver in any country is a wonderful image, a wonderful proxy for how that country looks at your country. And this is not just hearsay. If you speak the language particularly, taxi drivers can give you incredible insight. And in my conversations with taxi drivers between 90, now I didn't go to China between 72 and 99. So I was like Rip Van Winkle. I woke up one day and I found that the country which I had admired so much, which I had enjoyed so much, had transformed. It was really a different country. In the first time I went back to China in 99, I mean, to Chinese scholars, to a Chinese taxi driver, the notion that India could remotely be compared to China was ludicrous. That has evolved gradually. There is now grudging acceptance that here is a country that is actually moving forward quite smartly. But that said, the Chinese still don't really accept that India and China can be spoken of in the same breath, much less in the same sentence. But they do understand, yes, China, India is moving forward. India is an interesting market. And there was a point that that our convener made, I think Alka made it perhaps. Yes, Alka made the point that the Chinese seem to have a stronger assessment of the future of India than most Indians themselves. I mean, it is not simply out of Machiavellian plot to trap India that Chinese are today interested in India, that President Xi Jinping comes and promises $20 billion of investments, and 3 weeks later Indian press is jumping up and down saying, where is the investment that the Chinese have promised? They ignore the fact that when Modi goes, he signs deals worth $22 billion in Chinese business activities with India, much of it by way of investments. The Chinese finally now come to understand that here is a country that is very likely to move forward. But it will move forward in a different trajectory. It will not be the Chinese path remotely. And I would strongly commend to you T.N. Nainan's book, The Turn of the Tortoise. Any of you have not read it, at least read an online review of the book. It's a very fine review carried in Business Standard when the book came out. And Nainan is the publisher of the Business Standard, so I suppose they had to carry a favorable review. But he's also a very good friend of mine, and I will tell you, Nainan's book is really an eye-opener. He says, there is one sentence which I've quoted actually in my remarks. I'll just dig it out. Nainan says that yes, he says, what has often been said about India has also been said about Brazil. That it is a country of the future and will remain so. But having said that, Nainan adds, what is true enough is that the country, meaning India, is in a strong position to reach some of its long sought after goals. So the tortoise's turn is coming. But this is a Galapagos tortoise, not one of your little tortoises. This blighter takes a long time to move. When he moves, he has momentum, because the damn thing weighs half a ton, you know. So that is the story of India. Okay, I've gone on too long. Sir, are we out of time? Yes, sir. Here and then...
Relax, fast forward, sir, relax. Okay.
So you said about China went through a turbulent times, and that perhaps is the reason why they are so disciplined now, and India hasn't so far except for the Bengal famine. So what is the way out? Do we have to?
No, I mean, obviously, I cannot wish a cultural revolution or a great leap forward calamity on India. That cannot be done. What I'm trying to say is that, see, think of the liberation period. I didn't go into it, but it's all the facts are obvious. Between 1911, when the imperial China ended and Sun Yat-sen came to power, to 1949, when Mao Zedong and his government, his Communist Party, assumed control in Beijing. During that period of what, 30 plus years, 38 years, the tragedy of human suffering that was visited upon the length and breadth of China is almost impossible to imagine. In Nanking city alone, 200,000 people were killed by the Japanese in 1938 or 39. The Japanese said, no, it wasn't 200,000, it was only 20 or 50,000. Have we ever seen anything remotely like this? Jallianwala Bagh, at the end of the day, was one incident, terrible as it was. We have not known this kind of suffering. So maybe it has steeled the Chinese people into dealing with adversity in an extraordinary fashion. You should read good accounts of what happened during the Cultural Revolution.
But we also had the Tiananmen Square.
Of course. But then we've had 1984, and somebody will point to 2002 and Narendra Modi. The two are not comparable even in India, as we all know, but I won't get into that. No, it is not that you have to undergo suffering, but suffering steals a people. Suffering molds the character of a people. And maybe it gives them forbearance, it gives them a capacity to withstand things. But having said all this, let me add another element. China has been used to growing for 30 years at 10% per year, 8 to 10%. And we now know that this is actually the rate of growth that has taken place. It may be 1% this way or that way, but it has been the world's most rapid growth that any large country has ever seen in history. It's not a small achievement. But the compact on which that growth has taken place has simply been one of economic reward and political silence. That you may not question the system and the regime. You know, I have seen with my eyes poor people in China. They want to come and petition their problems. Firstly, in China every year these days, 12, 15,000, 20,000 incidents take place according to official statistics, where people rise up in revolt, protesting against this or that in a village, in a town, in a factory or whatever. There's a great deal of turbulence under the surface. But I've seen with my eyes an old woman going down on her knees in front of the Peking broadcasting studio to read out her appeal. Because that lady does not know who is the government of China. Where can I go and sound my cry of anguish at whatever suffering she has undergone? And I was told by some people professors who have lived in Beijing, foreigners, that this is a frequent occurrence. Almost every day. I don't know.
Yeah, still.
People land up. Because they say the broadcasting studio is the place from where the state talks to us. Even today, in this highly modern China, satellite dishes are illegal. Peking TV only shows 40 channels of the same mush that it spins out and has been spinning out for years. And what is the recurring theme in its adventure movies, serials? Japan's invasion on China. That's the constant single theme. You can sitting in a hotel room, scan through the TV channels, you find at least 2 or 3 episodes of this drama being played. Because this is a simple story of good and evil. Chinese were all good, the Japanese were the personification of evil. Complicated story. There's somebody else who had a comment? Yes, sir.
Sir, I have 2 small questions for you.
I'm worried about small questions. You have the most dangerous ones.
The first question is, Britons and the Chinese are the 2 most traveling races in the world. So, which one is more favorable for us? My second question is,
traveling races meaning, sorry.
Britons and the Chinese are known to be the most avid travelers in the world.
All right.
The 2 most avid travelers in the world. So, which one is more followable for us? My second question is, I want to make our kid a Chinese ambassador. What is your advice on that?
Again, I didn't get you. What you want?
I want to make our kid into a good Chinese ambassador. What is your advice on that?
Our team.
Kid, K-I-D, kid.
Next generation.
Kid.
Into a good Chinese ambassador.
Chinese ambassador. What is your advice on that?
You mean Indian ambassador in China or Indian promoter of Indian interests in China?
Chinese ambassador from the Indian China. What is your advice on that?
Can't be a Chinese ambassador. All right. Okay. I get you. Okay. Chinese are big travelers today because they've got money to spend. But don't forget that until day before yesterday, that is to say 1992, 95, Chinese could not travel abroad. You did not get permission to make a holiday visit abroad. It was impossible. Today they travel in droves. I think the total number of Chinese who go abroad is around 120 or 130 million per year, which is slightly bogus figure because this includes the chaps who go to Hong Kong for shopping. They go to Hong Kong to buy nappies, among other things, by the way. But genuine Chinese travelers are still 50, 60 million across the world. And when they mostly travel in groups, when they land up in a shop in Paris, for example, it's like a swarm of locusts. The shop is cleaned out. Nothing is left in the shop. Because they bought up everything that was on sale except maybe a few absolutely useless items. Britons are no longer such great travelers. I mean, there are many other great travelers. I would put the French much ahead of the British. The French are far more enterprising as travelers than anybody else today. They will go to the remotest regions you can think of, the harshest of deserts. And there are crazy Frenchmen who are still searching for the gold of Timbuktu. And some of them get killed in the process. This is toppy, it's life. But they are searching because Timbuktu was the land of fabled wealth, in days past. But the Americans travel, others travel, many other.
In numbers, Germans are one of the
Germans are. For India, Germans are big travelers. But, it's picture varies. What should concern us is that in the balance of visitors between India and China, there is a huge skew. The number of Chinese coming to India is small, and it's small because we don't offer enough facilities. Chinese visitors, they need language interpreters. Fortunately, many of our doctors who study in China come back. They don't get licenses because the Indian Medical Council is draconian, and many of them end up as interpreters. So why not? You study medicine, you become an interpreter. Why not? There are many examples of this kind of achievement. Now, second question about the next generation, your children, or our children of the future or grandchildren, as the case may be, that they should be good ambassadors of India to China, or ambassadors of India to the world. Expose them to the world. Make them aware of what is happening in the world. And I'll give you a practical suggestion. A colleague of ours at the Institute of Chinese Studies, by the name of Ravi Bhutalingam, is dedicated to the cause of promoting student exchanges between India and China. School students who go on family stay. That's very important. Putting them up in a hostel is okay. Nothing wrong with it. But family stay means that in those 2 weeks or maybe 3 weeks they spend in the other country, each other's country, they really gain an insight into the life of the people of the other country. And Ravi has a delightful story. He conducted a program at a school in Delhi where the group of Indian boys and girls who were going to China received a briefing before they left. And as the briefing was going on, he saw that there was an elderly gentleman who looked very disturbed and a little unhappy on what was otherwise a happy occasion, because parents were pleased that their children were going to China, land of mystery, after all, for most of us. When they came back, those children presented a few they staged a little dance of what they had learnt in China, of a Chinese dance. And somebody brought tape music, etc. So they performed. And the parents again appeared, and everybody was happy. And he saw that this gentleman was very pleased, but seemed to also be crying at the same time. So he went to him and he said, I noticed you at the meeting we had when these kids were going to China, and I see that you've come back, you seem happy, but you're also crying. He said, I fought in the 62 war. And when my daughter wanted to go to China, I was acutely unhappy. I didn't want her to go. My granddaughter. I didn't want her to go. But she insisted, and the parents said she can go, so how could I stop her? And he said, now I'm happy because I see that I was wrong. That is really the story of making connections. So I have a practical suggestion. If you can find a school in Shillong, because I know there are some fine schools here, public schools, whatever we call them. I can give you the contact of Ravi Bhutalinga and see if you can work out a two-way arrangement with a school probably in Yunnan province, taking advantage of the direct Kolkata-Kunming flight. So it's a very cheap flight. It's a 2-hour flight. Can you believe? China is 2 hours away from Kolkata. And we think of China as, located far away, Beijing is so far, etc. Maybe a program can be worked out. Because it is these kind of people-to-people exchanges, the kind of thing that you are doing, sir, Mr. Director, at your institute, by taking young and not so young participants on the courses, but not still young at heart, exactly like me, to China for a 4-month period. The next step is, of course, to receive Chinese students here. That is a missing step so far, and I'm sure you're working on it, but that's worth doing. Please, of course.
I was struck by what you said about the difference between Indian and Chinese societies. And you stated that Indians and Chinese to a large extent are highly individualistic. I think Indians are. Chinese? I mean, individualistic in what sense? Because here also, I mean, the whole notion that our lives are regulated by our associations within this larger complex of families, that we are born into families, we are married into families. This whole thing, I mean, individualistic in what sense? Because
Individualistic in the sense that each person essentially looks after himself or herself first. Or maybe family, but that can also be pretty individualistic. There isn't a strong sense of collective good. I mean, the most vivid example of this is that we will keep our personal homes pristine clean. No housewife will permit a dirty kitchen in her house or utensils that have not been washed the previous night. Do not leave utensils out in the sink for a maid to come in the morning to wash them. Your tendency will be, I'll basically clean them out. I don't want all this muck in my house. But outside my doorstep, any amount of filth takes place, I don't care. It's not my affair. This sense of personal cleanliness and collective filth pretty deeply ingrained in us. To me, this is a vivid example of individualism that we, all you say about family links, all that is true. But there again, we see the family in an individual sense. My family. I don't give a damn about your family. What you do is your business. I don't give 2 hoots for them. I may be polite and nice. My community, yes. If I'm a Patel, then I will say Patidars are being oppressed. I mean, the blighters who've been living off the cream of Gujarat all these years. I hope there are no Gujaratis here who know stories. But really, I'm a Gujarat. I know the story. Come on. You can think of many people in Gujarat or in other parts of India who are at the bottom rung of society, by all means. But it's the same picture as with the Gujars or with the Jats or anybody else. The people who want to claim rights for themselves, who feel entitled to more, are those who are at the topmost rungs of a kind of strata. Not the guys who are really deep down. The ones who are up there, they want to jump very much higher and reach the topmost levels. Because we are a stratified society. It's a plain fact of life. I was told, this will shock you. I was at the UPSC 3 weeks ago, and I was told about a chairman of an interview board who actually asked candidates in an official interview at the UPSC, what is your caste? Not one candidate. This was a standard question to many candidates. What is your caste? How dare somebody ask such a question? I mean, I regard the UPSC as one of India's hallowed institutions. You know, one of those institutions which has not fallen victim to inner decay. And then a foreign service colleague of mine, retired, told me that 2 foreign secretaries, this colleague only uses his first name. You know, there are many Indians who have now taken to using only the first name. Because they feel if I use my real family name, I will immediately be branded as belonging to X caste. So many change that. But there are some who only use the personal name. He said 2 foreign secretaries asked him in their office when he went to meet them, what is your caste? I said, my God, an Indian foreign secretary has the audacity to ask such a humiliating question. Humiliating not because the question is humiliating, but the intent is to humiliate, to make that person acknowledge that I belong to a quote-unquote lower caste. What nonsense. So in India we have all these paradoxes, and for all their deficiencies and defects, the Chinese don't have a caste system. Anything reason, yes, they do mistreat their minorities, but they mistreat them in a very different kind of way. There is a lot of subtlety to the mistreatment. But a Tibetan or a China or a Uyghur from Xinjiang cannot get a job commensurate with that person's professional training. And that is a reality, harsh reality. But you know, even the Japanese have a caste system. Did you know? The Japanese have a caste system.
So Rajesh, you've been on your feet for a very long time. No, you'll still be mic'd. You'll still have to be mic'd for a while.
Okay.
I just noticed that my name was there as a discussant, and I was.
Oh, I'm so sorry I didn't give you a chance.
So what? I'm just kind of grabbing my chance and get in. So what set off my thinking rolling was a question from behind saying that he wanted his kid to be an ambassador in China. I am a man of history, and when you go back in history, there were 2 famous Chinese pilgrims who had come to India. And Yuan Sang was somebody who had come to the northeast, to Assam at that point of time. And when he went back to China, he wrote a book called the Suyu Ki, Tales of the Eastern Lands. In that, he mentions that in Assam, he noticed that a song that was very popular amongst the masses was a song of Chinese origin, and it was sung. In those days, there was no television. So it's quite amazing that a song that's essentially Chinese was a song that was popular in this part. So the cultural exchange that we're talking of now was something that probably was already there. As a teacher, I was sitting listening to whatever was going on in the morning, and one thought was coming back over and over and over again to my mind was, we have a whole lot of people with a whole wide range of experience. How do we maximize their learning in the next 2 days? Half of today is gone. How do we direct discussions in a way that their learnings would be much more? And in this, probably there are 2 aspects to be seen. One, sir, you have been looking at the micro aspects of interpersonal relations, of negotiations, and the other is the macro aspect of culture per se. Now, looking at location of this IIM, interestingly, the Northeast, 98% of its borders are with foreign countries, and 2% of the landmass is actually connected to India. So yesterday, just prior to dinner, somebody was talking, I think you were talking about having to travel to Beijing in the next week or so, and I was saying, why don't you just go over to Arunachal and cross over? I mean, it's a 2-hour flight from Kolkata to the middle of China, Kunming. From this side, it's just easy to walk over. So one thing that's, I think, very, very important is the perspective that one has of China. The perspective that might be there in the rest of the country might not exactly be the perspective that different parts of the country might have. So engaging with China would probably have 2 facets, which I think is very, very important. I think much of the morning we have tried to look at how do we benefit out of the growing trade potential that's there between India and China. But one thing that I noticed out of my studies of China and my visits to China is that they might have a growth rate of 10% plus, but it's not that it's all hunky-dory out there. They have got serious problems. You're going to Beijing, and it's under a cloud of smog, and that's proving to be
And a little bit heavy.
yes.
So where do we?
So, come to Shillong. Some of the way they have treated their minorities has not been something to really write home about, and this has, according to some estimates, at any point of time there are about 10,000 internal revolutions that's going on in China at any point of time on any year, and that's a huge number by any indication. So what can be seen is that the Chinese could learn from us aspects of treating nature. One of the things that you were talking about is the great upheavals that the country has witnessed, be it the Cultural Revolution, the Great Leap Forward, or the Japanese aggression that has brought in an element of stoicism into their behavior, their demeanor. But probably one cannot overlook the role of philosophy in all of this, their Confucianism, their Taoism, and the way they look at life. And do we find a correlation between Indian philosophical houses and the Chinese philosophical houses? I was finding this interesting, the individuality of a people or the collectiveness of a people. Many of the people in the Northeast actually, if their migrations are traced, they have migrated at different points of time from different parts of China. Have they brought in a lot of their culture with them? Have they brought in a lot of their civilization with them? Is the Bihu festival in Assam, which is celebrated, does it have some echoes in some festivals in China? Are we doing enough on the cultural front? Are we trying to connect culturally so that the other doors would open? These are issues that would probably need to be looked at. And cultural affinities apart, I think with all that's going on in the polity, the world is becoming smaller. It's basically a fight for resources that's happening. China is running out of resources. There are huge concerns about the Chinese damming of the Brahmaputra, especially in the Northeast. How does one engage with China on those? What is the way in which we look at the problems? Would changes in the ecology of China affect its neighbors? If yes, how do we interact with it? We talk of globalization in terms of an economy. My colleague Rohit was talking about the father of economics, Adam Smith. One question that was asked to me in a seminar was there no economics before Adam Smith was born? Is man only an economic man, or is he or she also a social being, a political being? So do we look at man just as a producer and a consumer of stuff the way we are doing? So these are questions probably that need to be dovetailed into any discussion of interacting with cultures and people. And I think during the course of the day and tomorrow, these are some of the aspects that probably has to come in. And it's ultimately what's going to triumph is the people-to-people interaction that's going to take place. And that, I think, can ideally start from the Northeast, because in the Northeast, we also have very, very strong communities of Chinese who have migrated to this region and have not gone back.
Why are they not invited to such occasions? Yeah, we are talking about them as if they exist in a vacuum.
That's true.
They are here and they still are very, very connected to China. So they could have given us some perspective at least.
Yes. That's a point well taken. So probably in the future programs that we have, we will make it much more inclusive. But as an academic, as somebody who's been documenting this region, what I think is the canvas needs to be broadened. The canvas needs to be much more large than the mere economic thing that one would want to look into, because it's the globalized world economy is just one facet of the globalization. I think it's the globalized ecology that we're talking about. There was a ship of Chinese toys, essentially ducks, that was being transported to the US, and it sank somewhere in the Pacific. Within a couple of months, there was not one shore in the world where one of those ducks was not washed out. Which means that we are connected. What's happening in China is going to affect us. What's happening in India is going to affect somebody else. So we're really looking at the globalized ecology all over the world, and that's something that needs to come in. And it can happen not just in Paris, in the climate talks. It's got to happen in far corners of the country like this one. Thank you. I hand over to Rohit.
Well, I will keep it very, very short because Sanjeeb eats up all my time. Every time he does that. So, well, what something which I pulled out of Ambassador Rana's delivery and is of consequence. And this is something which took me back to a statement which one of my professors had once told me. When we were having a social identity class in psychology, and I said, what is social identity? You need to know something about you and this and that. And then he reached a point, he said, when do you get to know the other? When you first know thyself. There's absolutely no way to do that. Well, we've understood some of the consequences of this knowing process. And one of the consequences which some of us, those 7 friends of ours, where we ended up watching this movie by Amir Khan, and we almost became a big fan, where we watched him in the movie PK, and we realized, oh my God, it takes so much of effort to understand ourselves. Does it really? And that is what it takes. And that is when we encountered what it would mean if we are going to, be there in China, what all is it going to take? And immediately after that, we realized PK was such a great hit in China. Well, I'm just reminded of a small story trying to connect between various loose ends. Well, 2 of us again were back in Qingdao, probably for the first time. And we had gone out to the night market. And while we were returning, we lost our way. And it was middle of the night. And we had absolutely nothing to communicate with the taxiwala. And one of the taxiwalas stopped. Said, Hindu? We said, yes. Come in. We jumped in. And he started rhyming Avaramu. And somehow we could communicate where we wanted to go and where we needed to go, and he understood and he took us exactly at the place. And while we wanted to pay him for the taxi, he said, no, it's okay. Just repeat the lines for me. And he made us repeat the song, complete the song. Well, we insisted on paying that. Well, whom were we trying to know? Him or ourselves? The consequences are, as far as business is concerned, how do we design reporting relationships? Something which we were discussing yesterday. If I have a boss who's a German, I need to relate with him very, very differently. Leave aside relating with a business negotiator. If I have a boss who is a Korean or a Japanese, I need to relate with that boss very differently. But if I have a Chinese boss or a Chinese subordinate, how do I design reporting relationships, incentives, rewards? Because the same carrot and the stick which we are so tuned to understand business and organization and performance does not work in our context. It's, the Germans do it differently, French do it differently. It's just the pat on the back which works so beautifully in the high context locations. It's just not that. It goes beyond saying that Euro-American models of doing businesses, yes, have succeeded. Can there be a little better culturally consonant organizational designs which can take care of some of our local aspirations as well? Well, I will keep coming back with this.